This panel is about conservative foreign policy. I have three great panelists with me. You have their bios in front of you. I'll just introduce them very briefly now, which is my own particular spin. Fred Kagan, sitting immediately next to me, is one of the authors of the report Choosing Victory, A Plan for Success in Iraq, which is one of the pieces of the intellectual framework and the operational framework that underpinned the successful surge strategy in Iraq. You probably read about how he and the family Kagan, once referred to by Bob Gates as how many bleeping Kagans are there, have largely been responsible for some of the better pieces of strategy in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past couple of years. Fred taught history at West Point for many years, where we first met, and he's currently engaged in some very creative and interesting research at AEI on terrorism, among other things, so I'll ask him to comment on that as we go through. Andy McCarthy, of course, is a senior fellow here at the National Review Institute and a contributing editor at National Review, the magazine. Former chief federal prosecutor in New York City, and he has a best-selling book out, Spring Fever, The Illusion of Islamic Democracy, and of course, he's a favorite of many of the people in this room, and he should be a favorite of almost every American for having put the blind sheep behind bars. So an American hero in every respect. And John O. Sullivan, everybody knows him, of course, editor-at-large of National Review, was the editor of the magazine itself for 10 years, is also a fellow of NRI, and also directs the think tank 21st Century Initiatives. John's been an author and journalist for over 40 years and has incredible range in terms of the number of things he's done and the number of things on which he is expert. So, very pleased to have these three panelists. I want to get, during the panel, to some hot topics, some hot issues. We want to leave here with a sense of what really represents a conservative foreign policy, both the signature policies of what should be a conservative foreign policy and the broad brushstrokes of the ideas that underline it. But I want to start first, just challenge all the panelists here and just talk to you about foreign policy right now. Most Americans seem to believe that President Obama's foreign policy is successful. Our friend Ross Stewart wrote that Obama foreign policy has been an immense political success. It's co-opted foreign policy realists, neutralized anti-war Democrats, and isolated Republican hawks. It seems to be tough enough for a lot of Americans in the sense that he killed bin Laden and he's ramped up the drone strikes. It seems to be pragmatic, I think, to most Americans in the sense of balancing activism and interventionism versus backing off and letting others do some work in the world. And the conservative critiques of leading from behind and the apology tour, and I mean, there's been some real softball lines thrown by President Obama into our wheelhouse, and conservatives have rightly jumped at them, haven't really seemed to gain any traction. And I think during the election, both Governor Romney and Congressman Ryan said very intelligent things about foreign policy, but at the same time, I'm not sure ever really made the distinction for many Americans between their approach and the president's approach. So what's wrong with Obama foreign policy, and what's a good conservative critique of it? So Fred, why don't we start with you and we'll go on down the line.
Thanks, John, and thanks to Rich and everyone at National Review for all the great things that you do. It's an honor to be part of this event. I'm going to sum up two concepts that are at the heart of the Obama foreign policy, if you can call it a policy. The first is NOT, which stands for not our problem, which is the core principle at the heart of the Obama foreign policy, and it can be applied by them to any country in the world and any problem in the world, because fundamentally the thesis of that foreign policy is that nothing that happens in the world is actually important enough to merit America's attention, let alone America's involvement, with the exception, of course, of climate change. The way that NOP works, and the reason why I think it's been successful in American political discourse, is because it rests on another philosophical foundation, which I like to call consensus reality. And by this I mean that the Obama administration and its many allies on the New York Times and in the liberal elite, which is most of the media elite, of course, outside of this room. Reality is whatever we all agree that it is. So if we persuade ourselves that Iraq is irrelevant, then Iraq is irrelevant. If we persuade ourselves that we can do what we need to do in Afghanistan, whatever that might be with 3,000 troops, well then so be it. It reminds me of the old Kipling poem, the road song of the Banderlog. The Banderlog being a tribe of apes that believed that they could do whatever they wanted simply by wishing it so. And that's been the crux of this foreign policy. And the problem that we have is that it sells very nicely, because if you say that the policy is a success, and if the media and so forth not only backs you up on that, but refuses to report the major foreign policy failures, such as the enormous expansion of territory under the active control of Al-Qaeda franchises under this president, the enormous progress that Iran has made not only toward acquiring nuclear weapons capability, but also toward acquiring intercontinental ballistic missile capability. If you simply don't report on those things, well, then it's very difficult to challenge in the public mind how this has been a success. So that, I think, is our fundamental problem, that we have failed to challenge the consensus reality, even within the Republican Party, honestly, let alone in the national dialogue writ large. Reality will eventually catch up to us all, but we would do well to try to pierce this bubble as soon as possible so that we can start coming to grips with the world as it actually is.
Andy?
Well, I think if nobody challenges Obama on the national stage, it's one thing for a bunch of conservative pundits writing in magazines and on blogs to take shots at Obama's policies, which I think have been catastrophic for national security. I agree with John that they're a political success. The political success is what gets engineered by the public perception, which is a matter of the media filter and how much the other side effectively challenges your foreign policy. But Obama's foreign policy as a matter of national security is catastrophic for the nation. Empowering America's enemies, which is I think the linchpin of Obama's policy, is catastrophic for our national security. But if you have an opportunity like Governor Romney did, I'm not here to take shots at Governor Romney. I supported him. I think he'd have been a fine president. But on the other hand, the third debate was about foreign policy. And somebody in that camp got it into their heads that the way to win was to create no daylight between the candidate and the worst foreign policy president that we've had in modern times, to the point that we got to the end of the third debate and sort of thought that Romney was going to endorse Obama. I mean, that's what it got down to. We have a policy of empowering, in particular, not just, as Fred mentioned, these Al-Qaeda franchises, which take advantage of Obama's priorities, but also of partnering with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I would argue that we're no longer in the threat environment that we were in, say, 10 or 15 years ago. We don't have one major problem in the Middle East. We have two. We have Iran, which is every bit as much a problem as it's always been, but we also have the ascendancy of Islamic supremacism, the point of the spear of which is the Muslim Brotherhood. And the conceit behind the progressive foreign policy is that these are reasonable guys that we can work with. They're the moderate Muslims as opposed to the crazies. But have a look at what we see coming out of Egypt. Who wants the blind sheikh release? Well, Al-Qaeda wants the blind sheikh release, so does the Muslim Brotherhood. Who wants to impose Sharia and imposes Sharia at the first opportunity that they have? Well, Al-Qaeda does that, and so does the Muslim Brotherhood. There are tactical differences between Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood, tactical disagreements, but the fact of the matter is that on the bottom line, they are in complete agreement about where they want to take the world and where they want to take not only their own societies, but our society. Now, here's the problem. Islamic supremacism is different from Islam. And we have to be very clear on that. I've said any number of times, had it not been for patriotic American Muslims, we would not have been able, for example, to infiltrate Muslim cells, terror cells in the 1990s and thwart a number of terrorism attacks in which case we would have had a much worse security situation than we actually had. Those Muslims are our friends, our allies, they're Americans, and we need to do what we can not to alienate them in the course of protecting ourselves from the real threat. However, Islamic supremacism, of which terrorism is the number one, at least in terms of immediate threat, method of spreading that ideology, but terrorism is far from the only method of spreading that ideology, is our enemy. And it's antithetical to virtually everything that is a core premise of Western society and certainly American constitutional republicanism, beginning with the basic premise that the governed have a right to make law for themselves, irrespective of any code such as Sharia. Islamic supremacism flows directly from Islam. It doesn't flow necessarily from Islam, but we're deceiving ourselves if we don't see that there's an obvious connection. And I think the fact that Islam is perceived in the United States basically as a religion, rather than what I think it actually is. I'm not saying it's not a religion, it certainly has religious elements, but it's a comprehensive societal system that has ambitions to govern much more than what we think of in the West as religious code. And its tenets run completely opposite, in very basic ways, our core tenets, including not only the ability to govern ourselves, but freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, equality between men and women, between all members of all religions and even non-believers. I think we don't want to confront that because we have a real hesitation about confronting an ideology that springs from a religion, and it's really hamstrung us in a fundamental way. We have people who say that if you make these connections, it puts America at war with Islam, which I think is preposterous. But that's nevertheless been our compass. And as a result, we have been intimidated from taking the ideological fight to Obama. We don't want to make that fight publicly because we're afraid that we'll be called Islamophobes, that we'll be, marginalized as racists. But I think if we don't confront it, and I think the way to confront it is in the language of civil rights rather than, splash of civilizations rhetoric. I happen to agree with most of what Huntington wrote, but I don't think in terms of our ability to persuade people who are persuadable, I think we need to deal with this as a civil rights issue, which we're on the right side of, and which I think we could cultivate a lot of allies to our cause. But we have to find a language to confront this, and we can't be intimidated from confronting it just because it's seated in Islam.
John, Andy's right in that.
Thank you.
Okay.
You can go now, Andy.
Andy's right in that Islamic terrorists are not done with us, but we as a country appear sometimes to be done with them, or at least the president, they would like people to think that we're done with them. So is the president and his general policy reflecting true indifference of the American people or weariness of engagement with the world? Or is he leading the American public into, as Fred alluded to, a dangerous indifference and a dangerous disengagement, even retreat from the world?
You mean the leading from behind?
Right.
Okay, well, I think the first point to make is that you have to always distinguish between the popularity of the policy and the popularity of its results, short and long term. For example, when Congress really, rather than President Ford, but when Congress pulled America finally and fully out of Vietnam, this was undoubtedly reflecting a tremendous war weariness in the American population. And it was, in a sense, a popular decision, though not celebrated because it was shameful and a terrible thing to watch. But within a relatively short time, two sorts of things have happened. One is that it had been followed in Vietnam and Cambodia by genocide and the driving out of the boat people. And it resulted, secondly, in a tremendous collapse, almost, in American prestige and therefore American power and influence worldwide. And you had a whole series of events, which I think we have to include the invasion of Afghanistan, the introduction in southern Africa of Cuban surrogates for the Russians, and the advance of communism and Marxist guerrillas in Latin America, threatening second Cuba in Nicaragua and in El Salvador, or second and third Cuba. Now, those things, my view, and I think in the view of people like Henry Kissinger and others, followed on directly from the exhibition of American impotence in Southeast Asia. Now let's look at the... So therefore, don't make a judgment whether someone's popular. Of course, it's popular to bring troops home from a war with which people have been weary. Of course that's true. But a prudent statesman either won't do it, or if they do it, they'll do it in such a way as to minimize the damage. Now, let me look very quickly at a few things which are recognized to be Obama's foreign policy and ask, how it's done. Well, there is the general point that he retreated, and more than retreated, advertised his decision to abandon the concept of democracy promotion. I have a lot of problems with the concept of that. I mean, it can be overambitious and so on. But when the Iranian students rebelled, and when an election was stolen by the regime in Tehran, and people came out in vast numbers onto the streets, Obama very obviously emphasized and advertised his indifference to this. Now, whatever you think might have followed a change of regime there, I think it could only have been an improvement. I don't think it was exactly on the cards, but certainly a change of some kind was, and we backed away from encouraging that change, or from encouraging the people who were risking their lives. And they said so. They came up with placards and attacking him. Now, that was the beginning. Now he's starting to talk the language of democracy promotion again. The leading from behind, I don't object to leading from behind as a concept. Any sensible diplomat knows you try to spread the credit for success and also for blame, as a matter of fact. So you do want other people to be up there and getting some of the credit, and they're taking risks sometimes on your behalf. Well, what happened, however, you have to ask two things. Do the people are your allies really your allies? And in Libya, it turns out some are and some aren't, and the ones who aren't seem to be the ones getting the upper hand. And secondly, is the end result in Libya exactly what we want? Or closer to what we want than it might have been if it pursued slightly different policies? I don't think so. In Syria, I think it's even more obvious. Look, in the case of a rebellion, a civil war like Syria, you can do one of three things. You can support the rebels, you can oppose the rebels, or you can advertise that you are simply not getting in any way involved. We didn't do any of those things consistently. What we did was we gave verbal support for the rebels without taking the kind of steps to help them that would have given us some influence on who is going to emerge as the ultimate winner there. Now, I know Andy and I might take different views on this, but I think we probably both agree that the worst of all results is to encourage the victory of those elements in the rebels who were most opposed to the kind of policies we stand for. And that looks like being the end result. Al-Qaeda, well, it now controls a very large part of northern Africa and threatens the rest. Europe, a very important point which is often neglected here, American policy under Obama towards the euro crisis. The fact is, he is encouraging the worst possible policy in Europe over the euro. That policy is to try to pretend that the euro can be sustained, kept together, including everybody, including Greece and Spain and Italy and Portugal, for the foreseeable future. America is strongly backing that retention. In fact, the rational thing from an economic and therefore ultimately political standpoint, is for the Europeans to have 2 euros, a northern hard euro, a southern soft euro. And that's perfectly doable. I agree with those people who will say, won't it cause turmoil in getting there? Yes, it will. But we're going to have turmoil in not getting there if we don't do it. So we might as well have turmoil with some prospect of ultimate stability. At the moment, America is strongly encouraging the worst policy. And that has to be bad. It has to be bad for Europe. It has to be bad for the world, which needs some kind of stability, economic growth and so on in Europe, and it has to be bad for us as well. Now, there are other points as well, but all of these things stem from a policy which is essentially that of striking attitudes which can be sustained intelligibly for an op-ed or at most for an Atlantic article magazine, but can't be sustained as a policy over 4, 8 or longer periods in government.
Thank you, John. Now, let me ask this, John, because you brought it up, and I'll ask all the panelists. In the period 75-76, Ronald Reagan started to form with his advisors what would become the signature foreign policies of his administration. The outline, the landscape was clear in terms of the international structure, and the things he wanted to do to change or not change certain pieces of it became clear. So the time is on us now, before an election in some 4 years, to frame what should be the signature policies of a conservative foreign policy. And then we have to find a way to articulate them and lead on them. So we've alluded to some throughout this, but quickly, if we could go down the line, what should be some of the signatures, the real grabbers, the real marquee signature foreign policy initiatives of a good conservative foreign policy over the next 4 years? You can start with whoever wants to jump in.
So,
Okay, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I thought,
Oh, sorry. Fred? Okay, well, let's just go right down the line, Fred.
Okay. I feel obliged to say I am not now, nor have I ever been, a member of the neoconservative persuasion, in the sense that I do not believe that the best conservative foreign policy is an ideological foreign policy, and that's what, apart from being simply an anti-Semitic slur, that's what neoconservatism means to most people. It is not a question of ideology. It is a question of hardcore realpolitik, and I think one of the things that is very important for us to do is to retake the notion of realism from those who have absconded with it fundamentally and use it as a cloak for isolationism and insouciance. So I think that we need to have an entirely hard-headed and realistic foreign policy that's based on a number of core questions. The first of which is, what is actually happening? Not what do we agree is happening, but what is actually happening. The second question is, why do we care? And the answer in many cases will be, we don't care. But in a lot of cases, we will care, and articulating why is extremely important. The next question is, what could we do about it? And this is the step that we tend to skip over, because we tend, even if we're having this conversation, to go straight to what do we want to do about it, which is usually nothing. And then we have a conversation about that. But the first thing you need to do is ask, what could we do about it? Then you start talking about prioritizations and resources and so forth and unintended consequences, and you get to what should we do about it? And when you've gotten there, then you can start to ask what's required to do it. And that is the basis, I would say, for how we should be making foreign policy decisions. And it is entirely a question of protecting American citizens from harm, which is the overarching priority of any state. And it is amazing to me the insouciance with which we now greet the murder of an American ambassador on American soil in a foreign country, which is presented as something that Republicans are excessively overwrought about. We really need to calm down about this. This happens all the time, actually. It really doesn't, you know. It really doesn't. The last time we lost an American ambassador was 16-some years ago. More than that. It was rather a big deal. It is a big deal. And it was conducted, an attack, deliberate attack by an Al-Qaeda franchise conducted on American soil, abroad. We've had Americans kidnapped and killed abroad. And this is a matter of indifference. to a lot of people. It shouldn't be. The first requirement of a state is protecting the well-being, safety, and lives of its citizens. We can construct a very detailed foreign policy in the world of threats in which we live, focused only on the question of what is necessary to protect the lives and well-being of American citizens. And then we can talk about other almost equally important things, like protecting the well-being and functioning of the American economy, protecting our fundamental values, and so forth. Those are the things that we should be focusing on. What I would say as a tagline is that the Republican Party has gotten very adept at talking about the fiscal deficit that this administration's policies will impose on our children and our grandchildren, and the enormous price that they will have to pay. It is also imposing a security deficit. We are already minting the $1 trillion coin in the security realm. And this deficit will not go away by itself. It will not diminish by itself. It will grow with compound interest. And we need to ask ourselves, what kind of world are we going to be leaving to our children?
And just to echo a bit what Fred said about Benghazi, I cannot, for the life of me, understand, especially having sort of grown up in during the era of the Nixon scandals, where everybody in America knew the questions, what did the president know and when did he know it? It was like a mantra every night on the news. And here you have a situation where you have a 7-hour terrorist siege against Americans. The president finds out about it probably within the first hour. So Americans are under attack. We have assets to respond probably an hour away. What does he do about it? What orders did he give to protect Americans who were under siege? Who told him? When did he find out? And what did he do about it? And if he gave orders to protect Americans, who undermined those orders so that they weren't carried out? And if he didn't give orders to protect Americans, isn't that something we ought to know about and factor in? These are simple questions. You know, a lot of the issues that come to us in the foreign policy realm are complex and nuanced. This one is not. This is pretty straightforward. And yet we haven't been able to take an effective case on that. I think what you say about Reagan's growing approach beginning in the late 70s is something that we could really learn from, because Reagan, among other things, was very big on democracy promotion. And I would suggest that it was democracy promotion the way that I would like to see us do democracy promotion, which is to promote actual American values, not the idea that having a free election turns you into a democracy. As I've often said, when I was in the 3rd grade, we had a popular election. We elected a president, a vice president, a treasurer. Everybody knew the nun was still in charge. We did not have we had not become a democracy. We did not become a democratic culture. And I would like to see us promoting real democracy, real democratic values, and an understanding that democracy is a culture and an approach to living, not simply having a popular referendum. But that having been said, I think Reagan assessed the world, the national security situation, the threat environment that he was in, and democracy promotion became not so much a goal in and of itself, but something that was put in the service of the rest of America's foreign policy agenda. So to be more concrete about it, the Soviets were our major problem in the world, where aggressive real democracy promotion served American foreign policy interests in undermining the Soviets. Reagan was appropriately aggressive about it. Where democracy promotion, if it was pushed too hard, would complicate other American interests, they soft-pedaled it. And I think that's what we have to think of in terms of democracy promotion. We also have to think about how much does it actually affect our national security. The idea that country A, being a democracy, makes country B safer from terrorism is one of these great theories that will be forever in search of any evidence to prove that it's true. If your threat environment is other countries and you have empirical evidence that says that democracies tend not to go to war with each other, well, that's, you know, it then makes sense to try to turn places into democracies. But if your immediate threat environment is international terrorism, the fact is, and we know this is not just a theory, we know this empirically, terrorist organizations are expert at exploiting the freedoms that are available in democratic societies in order to attack and undermine those societies. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't promote our values. We should always promote our values. But we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that making or creating democracies is necessarily going to make us safer from an international terrorist outfit like Al-Qaeda, because I don't think there's any evidence for that, and in fact the evidence actually cuts in the other direction. I think our main threat right now, what we have to sort of prioritize is the jihadist threat. That hasn't really changed since 9/11. I think, you know, about a week after 9/11, Bush gave the speech in Congress where he announced what I still think was the pure Bush doctrine, sans democracy promotion, and I still think it remains the only roadmap for winning this war, which is you attack terrorists any place on the planet where they operate. We cannot give them safe haven. We cannot allow for them to have safe haven. And you have to treat regimes that aid and abet terrorists as if they were terrorists, which means the Saudis are not your friend. You know, the Egyptians in the control of the Muslim Brotherhood are not your friend. Now, this is not to say that we have to invade every place that's not our friend. That's never been the case. I mean, yesterday, I think 3 times we heard, at least during the course of the day, how Reagan's great achievement was to win the Cold War without firing a shot. A lot of times, the approach that I'm suggesting is misrepresented into this idea that, you know, we're just on a jihad of our own and we want to march into every capital and knock out every regime. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting, along the lines of what Fred said about taking the world as it is and being realistic about it, is not treating your enemies as if they were your friends, and not empowering them and making them more formidable on the world stage. So that we have to do in terms of turning back the immediate physical threat to us. We cannot allow terrorists to have safe haven. And then I think we have to deal with the ideological threat of Islamic supremacism, which not only seeps at us from the outside, but has also infiltrated not only our broader society, but unfortunately we have Islamic supremacist operatives threatening not only the opinion institutions, but actually within our government. And it cannot be, you know, people want to throw stuff at me when I say this, but, you know, Hillary Clinton has as one of her top advisors a woman who had a 7-year relationship in terms of employment, the journal that she worked at, with a guy, Omar Nassif, who ran an organization, the Rabida Trust, that is designated as a terrorist organization under American law. He wasn't just anybody, he was a major, major funder of Al-Qaeda. One of the people that he brought in to the Rabida Trust to run it was Wael Jalaiden, who is one of the founders of Al-Qaeda. If you look at her family background, she herself was a part of the Muslim Students Association, which is one of the building blocks of the Muslim Brotherhood's infrastructure in the United States. And members of her family were and are Muslim Brotherhood operatives Her mother, in fact, runs an organization that is part of a group that's called the Union for Good, which is run by Yusuf Qaradawi, the chief jurist of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Union for Good itself is also designated under American law as a terrorist organization. Now, I got to tell you, when I got my security clearance and had to get that re-up, if the FBI agent started to ask me about, my father's connections to the Muslim Brotherhood and my mother's connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, if I had started to tear what little hair I had out and say, how dare you ask me such questions, that's guilt by association, they would have looked at me like I had 3 heads. There's no way I would have been able to have a security clearance. There's no way that I would have been able to have impact on important matters of national security that came into my bailiwick in the Justice Department. They would have found somebody else to do it. And that's not a question about anyone's patriotism. That's just the way it is in national security and security clearances. But I think it's shocking that we have a situation where Huma Abedin is just one example of it. There are others. But we have people throughout our government who have connections to the Muslim Brotherhood. Not like tenuous connections, strong connections. We have a situation where in our intelligence community, they have made a policy of purging information in the training materials of our law enforcement agents, our intelligence agents, and our military people if the information casts Islam in a bad light, which back in the 1990s, when I was a prosecutor, we used to call evidence. That's insane.
Thank you, Andy.
John,
Right.
we've had... Bill Buckley once said that the defining element of conservatism when it comes to foreign policy is realism. We've had 2 appeals here for realism as the basis of a conservative foreign policy. It's the policies through which that be manifested. I mean, what comes to mind when you think about signature policies other than things we might have already heard here that we could really grasp over the next 4 years and get some traction with?
Well, first of all, let me say a word about doctrines in foreign policy. Disraeli was once asked what his religion was. He said, all sensible men believe the same religion. He was then asked, well, what is that? He said, sensible men never say. And I tend to believe that foreign policy doctrines are a bad thing. Very often, I don't say that unalterably on every occasion, a foreign policy doctrine is a bad thing. That would be a doctrine. But I say that in general, there are a lot of things you believe and intend to do which you don't want to keep talking about. And I agree. I mean, I think many of the things that Andy just said, I completely agree with. I simply wouldn't broadcast them as what I was necessarily going to do. Apart from anything else, my allies might feel I was intruding upon their legitimate sovereignty. And you have to respect those the things in others if you expect them to respect your sovereignty too. So I'm a little nervous of that. Secondly, I'm nervous for another reason. One of the many things for which Bill Clinton has apologized is his failure to intervene to halt the genocide in Rwanda. Now, why is that particularly difficult matter for him and for liberal internationalists in general? Well, because there is an international rule that if genocide is occurring, the great powers have a duty and an obligation to intervene. No if, buts, or maybe. It's a doctrine. What is the inevitable result of such a doctrine? The inevitable result of a doctrine obliging you to intervene when a genocide is occurring is that great powers will deny that genocide is occurring. That's what's going to happen, because they don't want to intervene. Now, foreign policy consists, in my view, of a combination of realism and idealism. We've just heard my critique of some of the wilder extravagances of the idealistic and ideological side. Let me turn briefly to realism. Pure realism is the doctrine that ideas and ideologies don't count in foreign policy. You can predict the behavior of a nation by looking at its interests. And if you know the interests of all the nations on the billiard table, you can more or less predict with some accuracy how they will click against one another and which will end up going into the holes at the side of the table and which won't. Now, as a matter of fact, that's not entirely false. But if it omits the ideological character of the regime, it omits something terribly important about that nation's interests. You couldn't predict the behavior of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia accurately, and of much smaller powers too, if you didn't take into account Nazi ideology and communist ideology. They were a major factor. They weren't the only factor. There were times when both sides betrayed their ideology in order to advance their interests. The classic case being the Nazi-Soviet pact, where they arranged to work with each other to advance their short-term interests, which were seizing half of Poland each, and in the case of the Soviet Union, the Baltic states as well. So I think statesmanship consists of making prudent judgments about the mix of policy in these cases. Now, I'll give you just two cases, and then if anyone wants to reply to me, they can on this realism point. The first is that in the pursuit of foreign policy, the United States is in a very difficult position compared to other countries because it's in every part of the world and it has things to do in relation to virtually every international problem. Now, its ideas, its ideology, its democracy promotion, that's a part of policy, but occasionally, of course, you're going to want to have a base, a military base, in a country where the local dictator has just slaughtered 400 people who were rioting. Now, in those circumstances, it seems to me it's useful for there to be a division within the government, as well as between the public and the private sectors, between those bodies which conduct foreign policy in the realist sense, and those which represent American values and continue to promote American values. I think one of the most useful inventions, a small one perhaps, but influential, of the Reagan years, was the National Endowment for Democracy and its sister organizations run by the Republican and Democratic parties. They have played, I can tell you from personal experience, a very, very important and useful role in not just promoting democracy, but just promoting human decency and reducing the amount of torture and ensuring that there is some kind of education for aspiring Democrats in countries in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, in Eastern and Central Europe. I was involved until a year ago with one organization of a similar kind. I was at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where we broadcast to all of these countries, where we have offices in a lot of them, not all, bureaus. Now, we used to define our relationship with the State Department as follows. First of all, by the way, we were enormously grateful to the State Department because it protected our people when they were arrested and imprisoned or kidnapped, which they were frequently, and in some cases murdered. And they were unstinting in this, and there was, as far as I am concerned, my colleagues, no praise was too high for the work they did. But at the same time, their job was advancing the interests of the United States at a particular moment in time. So they would sometimes be doing things which we didn't altogether think were a good thing. But our reporters, our editors, our commentators, their job was to promote the American values of liberty, free expression, honesty in the news, and so on. And that's what they did. Now, I think you can have that division in government. In my view, it's probably better when the government actually has a specific Bureau of Human Rights outside the State Department, something like that. But certainly the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, US International Broadcasting, which are outside of the state. I think that they're an important element in the long term, because frankly, I know there's some people in the audience who will be skeptical of democracy promotion. What is it that is the best and least dangerous form of democracy promotion? It is spreading, it is creating the arenas for free expression and free debate, because that accustoms people to a different attitude to life. They become different people. They become more deliberative. They become more willing to hear points of view they don't agree with, because they know that those points of view will be countered by points of view from their own side. So I would say this is a balancing act. You cannot lay down doctrines that are going to help you out of it. You need both idealism and realism in foreign policy. And I would argue that if I were to draw up a list of statesmen who represented these points of view, I would say Neville Chamberlain represented pure realism, Jimmy Carter represented pure idealism, and the best statesmen who were proponents of both, of using both intelligently in a combination that worked were, frankly, Ronald Reagan, Winston Churchill, and Margaret Thatcher.
John, since you introduced leadership and personality, let me ask a quick question. Let's try to do a very brief answer each, just maybe a minute, so we can get a few questions from the audience on leadership. In yesterday's Wall Street Journal, Peggy Noonan said the Republican critique of Benghazi, which we've heard a little bit about here this morning, she called it slobby, ununified, incoherent, and scattered. And I think those were among the nicer things she had to say about it. And so it brought to mind the question that you just raised. Is there a credible conservative foreign policy leader who can articulate a compelling and unifying and coherent conservative foreign policy? Or does that matter? Do we need one? The last 3 presidents all came to office with no foreign policy experience and were considered foreign policy neophytes from both parties. Is there someone out there who can bring us together around a conservative foreign policy that matters and can lead Americans, or does that matter?
Well, I mean, it certainly matters, by the way, because even if you don't know much about foreign policy in the campaign, you sure have to know a good deal about it when you're in government. It's one of the most important aspects of a president's policy. The second danger is this. If you arrive in the White House not knowing much about foreign policy, then you're not going to be... People worry that such presidents are going to be wild and impulsive and do all kinds of dangerous things because they don't have experience. No. The opposite is the danger. The opposite is they will do very little, and they will be ultra-cautious, not prudent in the... but so cautious that they're not prepared to respond effectively to almost any of the threats that emerge that arrive on their desk. And that, I think, is the bigger danger. It's not a danger that you have from Ronald Reagan. He took bold decisions from the word go, prudent ones, but bold as well compared to what others would have done. Margaret Thatcher was initially somewhat nervous because she knew that she lacked experience, but she was a quick learner and a very solid learner, and she quickly began to make bold decisions, the boldest of which, of course, in the early days was the Falklands War. And I would say that I do see someone out there. I wish I could believe that he was going to be president, but I certainly think he should be Secretary of State. He's a friend of ours, he's been on our platform, and that's John Bolton. And I think John exemplifies the combination of realism and idealism that I was arguing for. He's often described as a neoconservative. I actually don't think John is a neoconservative. By the way, some of my best friends are neoconservatives. I'm not one of those conservatives who are always attacking him. But John is actually, if I had to classify him, I would say he's an American nationalist. But he's an American nationalist of great prudence, and he respects and understands the interests of other countries, particularly America's allies as well.
Andy, any leadership names you like out there for conservative foreign policy over the next few years?
I agree with John about John Bolton, for sure. But I really think this stuff is event-driven. It's much more event-driven than people-driven, and people will have to be. I mean, we don't even know what we'll be arguing about a week from now, let alone in 2016. But I do think that there's a lot to be said for, as John mentioned, with respect to Margaret Thatcher, the notion that there are a lot of things that the people who are our main leaders are unfamiliar with. I mean, there's a vast amount of information that's outside their comfort zone. And the way our structure is nowadays, particularly with this 24/7 media, where you're supposed to go on these gas bag shows and explain the Muslim Brotherhood's rise in the Middle East in 3.5 minutes. I think there's a big temptation on people, not only on our side but on the other side as well, to oversimplify things that are actually quite complicated, and therefore to be pigeonholed in these almost caricatures of what neoconservatism is and what nationalism is. what Thatcher did, and what I think a lot of our leaders could benefit greatly from doing, is closet yourself, learn the issues, get people around you who are not just yes people, but will challenge you to try to understand the most important and essential elements of these things, and not pretend that things that are complicated are simple just because simple plays better on television. And I think if we did those things, we'd be better at confronting events as they unfold, and the people who will be our best leaders will come forward as those events happen. I wouldn't want to designate them other.
Fred, any thoughts? You've had a chance to work around some of the good ones. Work closely with David Petraeus, John McCain. You work at the same institution as John Bolton. Any thoughts?
I'm not going to put any names out. What I'm going to say is, I think almost any of the leading candidates, or the people that you might point to as likely candidates for the next election cycle, could do this. We've allowed ourselves to get into a realm in which we treat foreign policy and national security as the realm of experts, where politicians generally fear to tread, apart from those on the left who simply dismiss expertise and put forward entirely polemical, ideological views which carry the day. And I'm afraid we've fallen into a self-neutering cycle on foreign policy. This president oversaw one of the most calamitous 4 years of American foreign policy that we've ever seen. He is going to oversee another 4 years of calamitous American foreign policy. That is his stated objective, fundamentally. In fact, there's probably never been a president who stated as clearly as this one his intention not to care about what happens in the world. The problem is that the alternative is not self-evident. The alternative foreign policy isn't obvious to everyone. It's probably not obvious to everyone in this room. I doubt that everyone in this room agrees on what American foreign policy should be. As long as our candidates fear to articulate anything about foreign policy, we will have no foreign policy. There will be no Republican alternative, and there will be no Republican foreign policy. And that's a huge problem. First of all, it's a political insanity, because it took away from us it took away from the Republican Party in this last election what should have been one of the strongest arguments to make against this president, which is a catastrophic foreign policy, and instead, we did leave it entirely to him. And this is not just a question of how Romney ran his campaign, it's a question of how the congressional leadership ran its campaigns, ran its public platform. The notion that congressional Republicans don't have to worry about foreign policy because it's an executive issue fundamentally, and the candidate will carry the water, is wrong. All Republicans have to worry about foreign policy, all Democrats have to worry about foreign policy, and all Americans should be worrying about foreign policy. This is a matter of leadership and education, and we are making a choice as a party not to lead on this. All that's required is that our candidates choose to begin leading on this. And then we will discover that there can be a policy.
Okay, I've been given the 5-minute warning, so we will have, and I apologize for that, but these are very rich and highly accomplished men and foreign policy minds up here, so I wanted to drink as much of that as we could. So a quick question from the back, which we'll answer in a rapid-fire way, and then we'll move on. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. My name is Frank Holcomb. I'm an International Studies and Russian Language major at Texas A&M. During the third presidential debate, President Obama mocked Governor Romney for his concern about the direction that the Russian Federation is taking. If the Democratic Party wants its policy to be kowtowing to KGB thugs, then so be it. But what should the Republican Party's policy be towards Russia, and how can we remind Vladimir Putin that the Soviet Empire is long gone and will not be allowed to return?
John, you want to take a crack at that, or maybe Fred too?
Yes, well, very quickly, I would say that, yes, I share the disquiet that a lot of people feel towards the increasing authoritarianism of the Putin administration regime. I feel that the reset button policy has plainly failed, and I think that we need to pursue a policy. And I think we should be aware that there are forces in Russia at the moment bubbling below the surface, which means that the regime is not as stable as it looks, and we should be prepared, obviously, to offer help and encouragement to those democratic forces. The single most important thing we can do in matter of foreign policy, because we obviously don't want intervention directly in Russian affairs in anything that might be a dangerous way, is to give the support to Eastern and Central European countries that they feel has been completely lacking in this administration. I say they feel that they have actually said it themselves. 23, I think it was, East European leaders, Central and East European leaders, including Havel, then alive, and Wałęsa, and they wrote to the Obama administration, and they said this. They said, we feel we're being cut off. I think we have to re-establish good relations and demonstrate that we will stand behind them in not only in overcoming their difficulties, but also in standing up to the resurgent Russia, which under Putin is regaining its kind of neo-imperial outlook.
It's important to remember that in 2008, Russian armored columns rolled into Georgia and occupied portions of that state, which they continue to occupy. And under Bush, unfortunately, our reaction was extremely limp, to say the least. That's a bit of a problem when you talk about, holding back Russian reconquest. But the fact that the Russians were comfortable doing that also should tell you something about the likelihood of Russia being an effective partner with us. And this is an issue of consensus reality that's also very important. We cannot have an honest or intelligent Russia policy as long as we look to the Russians to extricate us from the consequences of our own weakness and fecklessness in places like Iran and Syria. And the Russians will not rescue us. First of all, they don't like us. And they want us to fail. And that hasn't changed for 90-some years. And second of all, our interests are not the same. And third of all, they are an authoritarian state at this point. And they don't like to see the spread of democracy. So until we begin by recognizing that Russia is not our friend and partner in the international community, there's no chance that we can have a sensible Russia policy.
And they launched a very effective cyber attack in advance of that armored invasion of Georgia, which should give everyone pause. And do you have 30 seconds on this before?
Yeah, we haven't talked much about sovereignty, but I think all of these international arrangements that are a legacy of World War II, if not before, have to be rethought. I don't see how you can have an effective policy that pursues American interests if we're locked into for example, a United Nations system where we can be stymied by Russia and China from doing things that are in our interest. We still have NATO together. Our NATO partner is now, one of our NATO partners is Turkey, where an Islamist government is rolling back an actual democracy. Turkey, by the way, is now the financial backer of Hamas, which under American law, it's a serious felony to provide material support to Hamas, I guess, except if you're in NATO.
Great. I'm sorry we didn't get to you. If you're students especially, we'll try to make ourselves available as we wander out to talk with you, especially apologists. We get to everybody who want to ask questions. But I'd like everybody to join me in thanking this panel for a very good